Good evening. Welcome to this special edition of Brass Tacks. I'm Zaka Jacob. As Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is all set to present the Union Budget for 2022, there's some good news from the economic survey that was tabled in Parliament today. The survey projects India to grow between 8 and 8.5% in the coming fiscal. Are we now well and truly back on a high growth path after 2 years of disruptions caused by the pandemic? What should the Finance Minister's recipe be, her relief package be for industries that have been hard hit by COVID? We'll have some of the biggest names of Indian industry joining us on this special show here on Brass Tacks. But first, the story so far.
It's the report card of the economy and a precursor to what we can expect in the coming year. Union Budget 2022 will be the 10th budget presented by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government and the second in the midst of a pandemic. The challenges for the Finance Minister, thus, are plenty. The big number to track is the GDP forecast for FY23. The economic survey tabled by the Finance Minister pegged it at 8 to 8.5%, much lesser than the revised projections of the IMF at 9%. Though the report said that all macro indicators indicated that the economy was well placed to face challenges held by a pickup in farm and industrial output growth. The other expectations is from sectors for increased allocation. Experts hope that the pillar of healthcare and well-being mentioned in the last budget will continue this time as well. The sector is hoping for increased allocation and expenditure to at least 3% GDP. There is also a clamour to relook at GST slabs and have one at 5%. On the tax front, though there are slim chances that there will be any big changes done to personal or corporate tax structure, from the common man, there are expectations for a reduction in burden in the backdrop of incomes that have been hit. The government on its part would want more adoption with the new tax regime that was brought in last year but met with muted response. It's a budget for a Naya Bharat, one that could potentially pull India out of the clutches of a pandemic and put it on the path to Atmanirbharta. The hopes of 1 billion people now rest with her. For CNN News 18, this is Ridhima Bhatnagar.
So are we now well and truly going back into the high growth orbit as the economic survey indicates? What is it that the Finance Minister needs to do to give relief and succor after 2 years of pandemic-induced disruption? Joining me now is a CII very special panel of industry voices. Some of the leading lights of India Inc. are joining us on this broadcast. Mr. T.V. Narendran is CII President, CEO and MD of Tata Steel. Sanjeev Bajaj, President Designate of CII, Chairman and Managing Director of Bajaj Finance. Dr. Kiran Majumdar-Shaw is Executive Chairperson with Biocon. Sunil Kant Munjal, Chairman of Hero Enterprise. And Vinayak Chatterjee is Chairman of the CII National Council on Infrastructure. Thank you very much for speaking with us. I'll start with you, Mr. Narendran. The survey has projected 8 to 8.5% growth for the coming fiscal. Are we now well and truly back to the days of high growth rate, the kind that we saw between 2003 and 2008 or between 2014 and 2018? After 2 years of heavy disruption caused by the pandemic, are we now nearing 8% growth and above?
Yeah, what's happened is the growth in this year that we're seeing is pretty much brought us back to where we were 2 years back. So next year is going to be very critical because if we can deliver that 8.5% growth, I think that's great. We will be back on track because we must remember that even before the pandemic, we were struggling at 5 or 6% growth. So 8% next year, if we can deliver it, will set us up well for the next few years. And I think given the investments the government is making on infrastructure, if we can prop up consumption a bit, I think we are on track for that.
All right, Mr. Sanjeev Bajaj, the government, of course, there's massive infrastructure spending that was put in place in the last budget, 5.5 lakh crores. What would be the top three things that you would want the finance minister to address, particularly in the context of job losses that have happened because of the pandemic and also dampened demand because people's incomes, real incomes, have fallen because of the pandemic? So what would be the three top focus areas for you from the budget tomorrow?
So first,
keeping in mind that the last few months
Mr.
are
Bajaj,
showing strong.
Yeah.
Keeping in mind the last few months are showing strong growth. It shows the resilience and the ability of our economy to come back. We have to, hence to me, the 3 points. One, pandemic is not over. Prepare for the next possible wave. The government has done a great job in preparations for the current third wave, but continue doing that because the disruptions it causes and the nervousness it causes to people's lives plays a big role on the slowdown in the economy. So one would be continued investment in healthcare like the government has done along with the private sector and prepare for the next wave to minimize disruptions. The second is that we are seeing green shoots of private investment, but these will take a few quarters by the time they get realized. Hence, continued investment from the government in infrastructure has a multiplier effect. I would say this is going to be very important in the coming year. Third is that as we continue with this growth momentum, it's not just about a year. It's about, as you said, getting a period of years now right. We know that the world is now cutting down on the fiscal and the monetary stimulus. Inflation is coming back. And for this, I would say that between the RBI and the government, provide a clear path towards getting to fiscal moderation. Don't tighten fiscal and monetary policies together. For example, WPI is high, but CPI is in control. So balance out the increase in interest rates and importantly, provide a glide path to the industry because this will help us then with no nasty surprises. And a combination of these three things takes us, I think, to that kind of strong growth beyond even 1 year.
Correct. And I think we need a few years of strong growth, 8% plus. You're absolutely right. But one thing that was focus area in the last budget and likely would be in this budget as well is healthcare. Last budget, it had gone upwards of 2 lakh crores if you include healthcare and allied sectors. It was 137% increase. Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, given the disruptions that we've seen, not just in this third wave because of Omicron, but also some of the glaring loopholes and the lacunae in the system that came to the fore in the second wave, what would your recommendation be, particularly when it comes to the healthcare sector? You are a doyen of the healthcare sector in India. Would you recommend that the government increase its healthcare outlay to 3.5% of GDP, as many of your colleagues are suggesting?
So, Zaka, I'd just like to say for sure, I think there's no debate on that because I think we are underinvested in healthcare for many, many decades. And I think the time has come to really get to that 3% that we've always been talking about. But having said that, and of course, we need to focus on reducing the out-of-pocket spend, which is really spiraling to over 70%. And that has to be reduced to 30%. I think there are many models that are being, proposed in terms of delivering a very sustainable universal healthcare model, which is really about managed care and, an insurance-backed managed care, which is very outcome-based. But having said that, I also wanted to comment on what's happening to our economy. I think I'm very concerned that whilst we are showing a robust economic revival, it's being driven by the formal sector. Mm-hmm. What I really worry about is the complete, decline in the informal sector. The informal sector has seen huge job losses. It has not yet been able to see any revival of growth. As we all know, There is a decline in consumption, both in the rural economy. And I think the MSME sector is one sector that really needs fiscal incentives.
Yeah.
So right now, there is a divide between the formal and informal sector. And that's why you're seeing huge numbers of job losses in the informal sector, whereas the formal sector is not showing those signs of employment decline. So I think you need to address this very, very seriously and very imminently. I also want to see a much greater divestment of our public sector, which has started very well with the Air India and a few other privatization that has taken place. But we really need to invest in infrastructure. That is what is going to create the jobs that we want in the informal sector.
All right. I want to go to Mr. Sunil Kant Munjal, and taking the auto sector as a barometer of the overall manufacturing situation in the country. While auto sales itself started picking up from the festive season of 2020 and had a pretty decent first 6 months of 2021, the last 6 months or so have been characterized by a very deep supply chain disruption. You've got higher input costs, and of course there is high fuel prices even now. What is your outlook for the auto sector for the coming fiscal, and what is it that you would look to in the finance minister's budget speech tomorrow in terms of relief and specific targeted incentives for the auto sector?
Auto sector, I think there is a lot to be done right now. First, this recovery that Naren just talked about has been a great relief for the country, but we must recognize that recovery is not across the board. There are sectors, as Kiran just mentioned, in the services area, within the automotive area, parts of textiles, parts of leather goods, and a lot of the small industry and the informal sector, which are still suffering quite badly. Sectors with the high touch, high contact, entertainment, travel, sports, and the like, all of them are suffering. So there is a need for us to recognize that there is support that has been given by the government was very helpful. That needs to continue. At the same time, a glide path for the fiscal deficit to come down also has to be announced. So there is going to be a little bit of this weighing of cost benefit as we try and weigh these things. And you spoke about auto industry. Of course, it is important because it is the largest multiplier on economic and industrial activity in the country in terms of what it provides by way of additional economic activity and jobs. And one of our biggest challenges right now is jobs, sustainable jobs, and sufficient income for individuals and the families to lead a minimum standard of living for themselves and for their families. Therefore, the focus has to go back also on basic infrastructure, like health, like education, as also ensuring that the private sector now starts crowding in investments as the private sector's capacity utilization goes up, because it's now close to 70%. There are individual companies that have gone higher and announced capex plans. So I think that's good news. But we need to keep a watch that a lot of India is still self-pay in terms of healthcare. We have to expand the overall spend in India on the entire health system to be able to improve both the quality and, more importantly, the reach to Indians across the board. I hope the finance minister will surprise us pleasantly tomorrow, as she did last year, and not focus too much on the politics with 5 state elections coming up. She's done a wonderful job of balancing the books as also incentivizing growth over the last few years. I hope that focus and that attention will continue.
All right. I want to ask Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee, in terms of infrastructure, and everybody on the panel will also agree that infrastructure spend is going to be one critical area, not just for job creation, but also putting us on that high growth orbit, as it were. Last year's budget mentioned a 5.5 lakh crore spend on infrastructure, but the experience of the last year has been that much of that money has not been spent, or at least capacity utilization there has not been optimum, whether it is central government or state governments. How does one better the utilization of this money? And going forward, one is expecting the infrastructure spend to be in that same ballpark with the government not taking the foot off the pedal, as it were.
Look, I think there is virtual unanimity amongst economists, analysts, political and bureaucratic class that in the coming year, the coming fiscal, it is going to be public works and infrastructure spend that is going to continue to be the pump primer of economic growth. And that the multiplier effect of spend on infra should be spilling over to other areas where we want action, like crowding in private sector investment, creating multiples for jobs, etc., etc. So my expectation is that after a 26% increase in outlay last year, which took the budgetary outlay to 5.54 lakh crores, I am expecting the finance minister to announce a 25% increase in the infra budget outlay to take the figure to 7 lakh crores. Now, that is something that which would probably be the minimum desirable to affect the pump priming. Over and above that, I think we are looking at some interventions on the capital market side. The Reserve Bank has been rather scathing in its report about the condition of urban local bodies. Their finances appear to be in tatters. So I'm expecting some package for market making of municipal bonds. I'm expecting certain package to enhance the Manrega scheme for rural employment, a similar scheme to be extended for urban infrastructure and urban works, so that the multitudes disadvantaged in urban India are also taken care of in the social net. I am expecting a greater degree of transparency in the operating ratio calculation of the railway budget, because the CAG has come up with, again, criticism about the operating ratio announced last year, where the budget said it was 98, which means revenue was 100 and cost was 98. So you had an operating ratio of 98, whereas in actual practice, it was 114 or 118. So a greater transparency in railway accounting and a huge focus on implementation, because the November end report of the Ministry of Statistics also said that there are 4.5 lakh crores of delayed projects, which is a significant drain on the total spending ability of the economy. So I'm expecting a huge thrust by the FM on announcing measures to focus on project execution, like Gati Shakti, National Single Window System, surety bonds, implementation of the very hugely radical reforms in public procurement, which has to do with timely payments, etc., etc. So there will be a huge focus on implementation also. I am expecting some reference to the high GST on cement, which is, cement is an Aam Aadmi commodity, but it is taxed at 28%. 62% of people who buy cement do not have the benefit of input, cannot take the benefit of input tax credit. So while it is a GST Council matter, I expect the budget to touch upon the fact that a 28% GST on cement is regressive. Similarly, while the last budget brought down the GST on electric vehicles down to 5%, however, the GST on batteries that go into the electric vehicles, which is almost 40% of the cost of an electric vehicle, needs to be brought down from the current 18 to 28%, again down to 5%. And finally, there's going to be a huge thrust on green energy. And therefore, both the FM and the Prime Minister have made a very spirited plea for hydrogen, where India is expected to become a global supplier. So I expect in the budget a strong package for encouraging hydrogen usage. And that can only happen in measures like, shall I say, a PLI scheme for manufacture of electrolyzers and an investment allowance for setting up in situ hydrogen manufacturing capacity across various industries like steel, cement, chemicals, etc. But let me stop.
Let me ask Mr. Narendran, of course, one of the things which is going to be critical, this has both an economic cost and a political cost, is job creation. The latest data from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, as of December 2021, the unemployment rate across was 7.9%. Urban unemployment was upwards of 9%. What does the finance minister need to do to address this almost core concern?
So I think at the social security side, we talked of the Manrega scheme. Vinayak talked about it. I think Kiran also talked about it. I think that's important. But having said that, there are some specific sectors which need the support. One is the high contact sectors, as Sunil talked about. We need to focus on tourism, for instance, because that's a great employment generator. Construction and the focus on infrastructure is also a great employment generator. We also need to look at sectors like textiles, electronics manufacturing, etc., which are also getting supported. And I think the export growth in both textiles and electronics manufacturing is encouraging, because these are all sectors which employ a lot of people, employ a lot of women, employ far away from the urban centers. So there's a great need for us to create job opportunities there. And I think some special support for these sectors which have been impacted the most, because some of these sectors can take care of themselves, but some of these sectors, the MSME sector also needs the support that is required to have the job creation that is required.
Talk to us a little bit about the MSME support, because through 2020 and 2021, something to the tune of 3.5 lakh crores was meted out to the MSME sector. There are, by any estimates, between 7 to 10 crore MSMEs. Why are they still struggling despite the amount of PLI that's been given specifically to the micro, medium and small enterprises?
Sorry, are you asking me?
Yeah, Mr. Narendran,
Yeah. So even if you look at the MSME sector, there are some MSMEs which have done quite okay. There are some who need support. So, while the liquidity has been very helpful, but, we must not forget the fact that even the period leading to the pandemic was a pretty tough period, because the slowdown was there. The auto sector, which supports a lot of MSMEs, were also, was not doing so great. You had the issues with the NBFC, so lending was not so great either. So prior to the pandemic itself, a lot of the MSMEs were struggling, and the pandemic in some sense was the last straw. But I think in some areas, the government has done good work, like I said, giving liquidity. The other thing is ensuring payments are made on time. At least the central government payments are being made on time. A lot more work needs to be done at the state. The government has also requested big companies, big industry to also support MSMEs by paying them on time. But I think in the medium to longer term, we also need to look at how can the MSMEs climb the ladder, go into more niche areas, high quality areas, technology intensive areas, like it is in a Germany or in Italy or a Korea, where the MSME sector is actually pretty high tech, globally competitive, need not be large in scale, but very specialized in what they do. And I think the Indian MSME sector needs to be supported to make that journey. Many of them in the auto component field are already there. So we need to have more such examples in the MSME sector to make it sustainable.
Sanjeev Bajaj, one big green shoot, bright spot, one would say, has been the creation of unicorns, the creation of startups. By some estimates, in 2021, the calendar year of 2021 itself, there have been close to 40 Indian startups that have become unicorns. How does one, though, bridge the gap between what these unicorns, the promise of them being transformative to the Indian economy, and yet at the same time, ensuring that they create enough jobs for our large swathes of young people?
If you actually see over the last couple of years, and you said, even just last year, by some accounts, it's 40 unicorns, what you're seeing is the next level of entrepreneurship and the ability to scale it up because of alternate forms of capital, private equity, venture capital that's available, which 20 years ago wasn't there. So this is clearly going to be a continued trend, and we will see many new such ideas get converted into business opportunities. And look at some of the big unicorns already, the food delivery services, the shopping services, they employ significant numbers of people. So it's helping with employment as well. What we do need to see is that a lot of these services are still quite basic. So what they've managed to get a great hang on is in accessing customers, intuitive apps, which all of us end up using, and they're able to tie that with delivery of products and services. But end of the day, that is still a simplistic level A kind of service. Over a period of time, competition will increase, which means you need greater innovation. And at the same time, you need models where there's a clear road to profit. And I think this is important, not only for themselves, but so that we show successful business models so that 40 becomes 400, becomes 4,000 in the coming years. So to me, that is very important for us to see.
All right. Let me go back to Kiran Majumdar-Shaw. Obviously, work from home, WFH, has changed the way not just individuals approach work, but also how companies approach work. Has the time come now for us to ask questions whether government needs to give incentives for work from home? For example, the deductions that you have on tax have not changed in years. Is it time to incentivize work from home in terms of, a broadband allowance or a tax-free allowance to set up infrastructure that's required to work from home? How much would that have a knock-on effect on savings for the middle classes?
Well, I don't think that we should be differentiating between work on site and work from home as a model of incentivizing people to work from home. I think companies need to figure out a balance, and it needs to be a sort of a rotational kind of option for employees, because I think that's what most companies are trying to develop as hybrid models. But having said that, I do believe that you need to provide more disposable income to the salaried class, because you need to spur consumption. And from that point of view, I would like to see, and I hope the finance minister will announce some tax breaks for the salaried class. I hope that the non-taxable slab is increased to maybe 5 lakhs, and perhaps the 5% tax slab is also increased to maybe even 10 lakhs. Mm-hmm. I think you need to put more money in the hands of people, because it is very worrying. The consumption has gone down, and we need to get consumption back on track. So I think that's the only way we can start spurring some, investment incentive. Consumption incentives. Apart from that, I also believe that, like most of the other panelists have talked about, we need to focus on employment coming back in the services sector. We are seeing a huge decline in the services business, and we must see how we can bring those jobs back. So the faster we open up the economy, the better it is for economic revival. Okay. And I, for one, believe that we should rely on our very good vaccination deployment to give us that confidence and comfort that we can open up.
Correct. We had reports this morning that more than 95% of adult Indians have got at least one dose, and 75% of adult Indians have got both the doses. So that is a positive net for coming back to some kind of, normal way of life, as it were. Let me go back to Mr. Munjal, and I want to touch upon again this MSME story. And there seems to be this sort of mismatch between what the government has announced in terms of PLI schemes and other liquidity support for MSMEs, and some of them turning back into the black. Where is that gap? Because many of these MSMEs, of course, feed into industries like auto.
Yeah. So there are three aspects to this that we need to keep in mind. One is that a majority of MSMEs do not have a good sales or marketing system of their own. They are dependent on other enterprises to be able to do that for them. So which is why they look at industrial customers as their primary customers. And if that industrial customer suffers in their business, these small units automatically also suffer. Second is, despite all the support and the regulation announced by the government, the actual access to liquidity for the small industry has been limited. So the top end of small industry has done well by getting access to bank funding. But a lot of them get squeezed out of the bank funding, have to go to informal funding sources. That's both expensive and availability is erratic. So they actually suffered on that account. And third, of course, has been what has been driven by many parts of the economy due to the COVID. So I think on the one hand, we need to figure out that we have poverty in the small enterprise, we have poverty in the urban areas, and we have a potential for job creation in the startups that you just talked about a little bit earlier. Mm-hmm. So if we can touch at these three levels, the potential multiplier effect is pretty enormous. So if we can create a scheme like we have in the rural areas, like the Manrega scheme, if we can create a similar scheme for the urban poor, you could first improve their quality of living and then improve consumption, the spend on consumption automatically creates a kicker for additional production and therefore additional capacity, therefore additional jobs. It's a virtuous cycle that you can create. The startup, are a wonderful new tool to actually create lots and lots of jobs. You were asking what has been created. By the way, a large part of the new jobs that have been created over the last 2 years itself have actually come out of startups. And there's enough evidence to demonstrate that.
Yeah.
Because large existing organizations try and become more and more efficient by automation, robotics, computerization, artificial intelligence. So they don't add a large number of jobs unless they're creating a new unit or something. Mm-hmm. So these new jobs actually get created in the informal sector and the small startups. I think that's why it's important for us to focus on these three legs at this level.
Mr. Chatterjee, when we talk about infrastructure spending, how can we not talk about the real estate sector, not least because it's also been one of the worst hit in the back of the pandemic, but also erratic lockdowns. There are state-level differences in lockdowns, so on and so forth. How does one address the question of real estate, bringing back real estate to some semblance of normalcy, and also therein address the question of this disparity? There are still cities like Mumbai where there is a dire shortage of housing, and there are cities like Delhi and Bangalore to some extent where there is excess inventory.
This is Vinayak. This question is to me?
Yes, it is to you, Mr. Chatterjee. Yeah.
Okay, see, I think at a broad brushstroke, the real estate market in terms of real estate developers can be broken into two segments. One, that are compatible with RERA, the real estate, the new guidelines, which are strict guidelines of how they should behave in terms of their financial and project management. And there is another segment which has actually suffered with incomplete projects, unfinished commitments, and all of that. So there are two broad classes of real estate developers. I personally think that there's going to be a shakeout. The ones that have not been in conformity with RERA guidelines are slowly going to get marginalized, or not so slowly, rapidly get marginalized. Mm-hmm. And the ones that are in conformity with RERA guidelines and the professionalism that it demands are going to see an uptick. But the point you made is very valid, that there is no macro point of view on real estate. It's a very disaggregated industry, city by city, town by town.
Yeah.
And therefore, in some cities, you find a scarcity of supply, and in some cities, you find a vast overhang of unutilized, unsold stock. So exactly how it's going to pan out, I'm not very sure. But the year ahead will give us definitive signals in terms of how the real estate market is shaping up. And a large portion of it will depend on the level of confidence of the middle class, which really buys the bulk of the housing, and corporates in terms of their enthusiasm to increase their headquarters staff or branch office or take more commercial real estate. I am not sure how the year is going to pan out on both of these. But again, different cities and towns may have different experiences. We will have to see how that plays out. But as I said, I'm repeating the point, I am expecting the FM to make some reference to the 28% GST on cement. Mm-hmm. But may I, with your permission, if I may take one more minute?
Yes, sir.
I actually want to make, or draw your listeners to a rather interesting strategic shift that's happening in the infrastructure space overall, which is that in the last 3 decades, as a country, we have been scrambling to organize finances for infrastructure development. Mm-hmm. And we have reached a very interesting stage where our financing capability has reached a level of maturity. Let me tell you how. If the budget this time allocates 7 lakh crores, as we discussed earlier, which is a 25% increase, matching that, the states are sure to do about 6 lakh crores. The public sector undertakings and extra budgetary resources will add 2 lakh crores. The new national bank, the new DFI, will add 3 lakh crores, and domestic and foreign capital will add another 4 lakh crores. If you add all of that together, you will find that as a nation, we are now close to having a financial capability of financing 22 lakh crores of infrastructure public works in a financial year. So the huge stress on trying to organize finances is largely over, and we have reached a mature stage in financing ability. But same cannot be said of project execution. And therefore, a large portion of the budget must focus on ways and means to monitor and push project execution and monitor project delays. But let me stop here.
Okay. Let me go back to Mr. Narendran and to Mr. Bajaj. Mr. Narendran, just in terms of the impetus, and you said this in the previous answer as well, the contact industries, whether it's hospitality, travel and tourism, are they still looking for some kind of relief package from the government, or is it more give us constancy of policy? Let's not have these arbitrary lockdowns and state-to-state differences in these lockdowns. Can we learn to live with the pandemic and the industry will bounce back?
Yeah, I think the starting point is what you just said. They've suffered the most through these lockdowns, and some of these lockdowns have not been so effective, right? And they've suffered the most. And this sector alone, I think, provides for 10 million jobs. So it's not a small sector. So I think we need to help them because they've suffered from all three waves of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure, particularly the smaller ones who've struggled and many have closed, they need to get back onto the feet. So firstly, we need to promise them a bit of policy stability at the local level because it's not something the central government can do. I think there's something between the center and the states and the local bodies. We need to make sure that these businesses can get back on track with whatever safety protocols there needs to be. The second part is those amongst them that have suffered, we need to give them some incentives because if you really look at the first two waves, most of the incentives targeted at the smaller companies were largely to the MSMEs, but the hospitality sector got left out of it. And I think they need that support. And we need to see whatever that can be done. I mean, there were very interesting schemes in the UK and places like that to get them back on feet. So we need to think about what works for India and how do we get them back on their feet. And I think a lot of urban unemployment also comes from these sectors.
Mr. Sanjeev Bajaj, one factor which could possibly be a running theme through this coming fiscal, but I'm not sure how much the economic survey is taking that into account, is the tapering that we're seeing in the developed markets, not just the Federal Reserve, but other central banks as well. Already we are seeing the Indian markets, for example, trading off their highs that we saw in the latter part of last year. We're selling at about 6 or 6.5% discounts from those highs. How much would that be a factor going forth in this fiscal?
I think that's a very important point. And as you correctly said, the tapering that has started off in the West will have some impact over here, and you can start to see that. However, if you remember the taper tantrums, I think, 2012, hopefully the West has also realized from that this must be a gradual and steady change that they end up driving. More importantly, given the size of our economy in these years and the fact that we chose a path when we expanded our fiscal stimulus as well a couple of years ago, we chose a path that suited us more. So a lot of the Western economies, because they had strong currencies, went and printed a lot more money than we did. They focused more on the demand side. In our case, we focused more on the supply side. And we did reasonably well following a strategy that was more suitable to ourselves. And I hope what we see now in the coming year is a similar indication as we go back to moderating the stimulus. And as I said in the beginning, I would expect firstly to see some direction on it provided by the central bank. And then this done, again, in very good collaboration that we've seen so far between the central bank and the finance ministry. So it's done in collaboration so that there are no sudden shocks.
All right.
Economy is given time to prepare for it and as suitable for our situation.
Okay. Mr. Munjal, I'll give you the final word. Just briefly on electric vehicle policy, what more directional sort of...
You're going on insisting and asking me questions on the automotive. I am not involved in the automotive industry. Let me take on one sector which was being covered right now and I think did not get full justice, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When I spoke about it, the real estate business is the second largest multiplier after the automotive industry. The impression about this industry continues to be the old one, where it was considered a near criminal activity with only a few players playing with a straight bat. Since RERA has come in, that is all in the past. Only the straight players have a chance to remain in the industry now, and anybody who steps out of line gets caught and penalized right away. It's now time to consider this not only an industry, but also an infrastructure, because it is also the largest employer of unskilled and semi-skilled labor in this country.
All right.
Also, once we switch to electric vehicles and clean fuel vehicles in the automotive industry, this will have the largest multiplier effect on the economy of the country. So it's time to turn this into infrastructure, encourage the sector, provide the support that it needs, give it additional funding availability, and also support those who are looking to acquire homes for themselves, which is a massively needed social good.
All right. We'll have to leave it at that. I'm completely out of time. Thank you very much, though, to Mr. Munjal, Mr. Narendran, Mr. Bajaj, Mr. Chatterjee, and, of course, Kiran Majumdar-Shaw for joining us on this special broadcast of the CII panel and their expectations from Union Budget 2022-23. It's going to be a difficult balancing act. We'll see if and how the Finance Minister is able to walk that tightrope. That's a wrap. I'll catch you again tomorrow. We'll have special coverage of the Union Budget starting 7 a.m. with a special panel of industry voices, economists, budget experts, and what have you, all through the day here on CNN News 18. Thanks for tuning in. But the coverage continues right on the other side of this quick break.